Hello, everyone, and welcome to Research Ride, a 30-minute journey from idea to implementation of research programs in the Department of Medicine at Emory University. I am your ride leader, Charlie Searles, and I'm a faculty member in the Division of Cardiology and the Associate Vice Chair for Research in the Department of Medicine. Hey, Sarah.
Hi, Charlie. I'm very excited for today's guest.
Yeah, me too. I've known our guest for many years since he was a cardiology fellow, and I've actually ridden bikes with him.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
Well, let's get this ride started. Today, we will be touring with Dr. Neal Dickert, Associate Professor of Medicine and a colleague of mine in the Division of Cardiology, and Associate Director of the Emory University Health Services Research Center. He is also a Senior Faculty Fellow in the Emory Center for Ethics, and he has a secondary faculty appointment in the Department of Epidemiology at the Rollins School of Public Health. Dr. Dickert also directs the Capacity and Recruitment Center of the Georgia Clinical and Translational Science Alliance, otherwise known as CTSA. And I know for a fact that he is an avid cyclist. Welcome, Neal, and can you start off our research ride by just telling us a little bit about your research?
Thanks, Charlie. Really nice to be here. So I am, I identify primarily as a cardiologist, and my research really focuses on issues related to ethics, and that kind of divides into two spaces. So one is focused on research ethics and really how we go about the practice of doing clinical research, particularly in cardiovascular disease. A lot of that focuses on how we explain and communicate about research, how we go through processes of recruitment and informed consent. And a lot of that work has focused specifically on both sort of recruitment tools and research in the context of acute care, where there are significant challenges and sometimes it's impossible to get consent, and how we go about doing trials like that. The other side of my research is, I would say, very closely related, but more in the clinical space, and that's really focused on ethics and decision science. And we have a number of projects looking at how we communicate with patients and how we partner with patients to make decisions. And a lot of that, and really a lot of the work in recruitment too, really gets at what I think are really interesting concepts rooted in behavioral economics and different ways of influencing and communicating with people.
So the one facet of your research and the other facets sort of work together, or they complement each other.
That's right. Yeah, I really started a lot of my career focusing on research ethics, and the sort of clinical space has been something we've moved into more in recent years. But I think they're sort of two sides of the same coin.
And I just want to clarify, because on the surface you would think that you do research on how to do research.
That's one half.
But really there's more to it, as far as you're looking at the psychology of research, both from the researcher and the participant.
That's right.
And how did you get into this field of study?
Very accidentally. So I suppose it's worth telling a little bit of more background than is truly necessary, but I was a philosophy.
No, we're very interested in your background.
So I was a philosophy major in college. I think I thought I was going to go to law school, but the truth is I don't know that I had thought too much about much. And then very haphazardly on a ski lift, I think one day decided, I think maybe I should be a doctor. I had no ambitions of being a researcher.
A ski lift in New Hampshire.
It was in Colorado, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. I was working at a ski company for a winter. And I really thought, there's a lot about medicine I've always, that when I really think about it, that's what I think I want to do. And then entirely haphazardly wound up deciding when I graduated, because I still had a couple of pre-med things and MCAT to take. I decided I was going to move to DC, and wound up as a pre-doctoral fellow in what was just being started. It was the Department of Clinical Bioethics at NIH. And it really is hard to describe how haphazard that process was. but I really lucked out. And that was something that I thought, well, I like ethics. I'm a philosophy major and I want to be a doctor. I should probably like medical ethics. Had no idea what I was getting into. And I thought that'd be okay for spending a year or two and engage me in some interesting stuff. And really wound up, in a really pretty special place. I had two great mentors, in particular, Zeke Emanuel and Christine Grady, who really, kind of turned me on to doing this kind of work. I was in a really great environment, and from there on, I decided to do an MD and PhD with a PhD in health policy and bioethics, and that's really how that all started.
But bioethics is a broad area, and you have a very focused or somewhat focused research area. How did you come to that?
Yeah, so I guess the sort of two focuses, or two things I focus on are kind of decision making and then the research ethics space. The research ethics piece actually came first for me. So being at NIH, where essentially everybody at the NIH Clinical Center is on a protocol, right? That's a research hospital. They have done a lot of work in research ethics, and when I showed up, I remember I was basically told, you're going to work on this issue about paying people for participating in research. And I remember thinking, so what's the issue? I often give a talk where I told my grandmother what I was going to be doing. And she said, well, honey, is the problem people aren't getting paid enough? And it's one of those things where I knew nothing about the landscape. I didn't know why that was going to be a concern. But so the first paper I ever wrote, the first thing I ever did was about incentives for research participation. And so that got me very sort of squarely in the research ethics space. And I have always been really interested in this issue about how we simultaneously, for lack of a better way of saying it, use people in research, and how we do that ethically in ways that help us to grow our knowledge base. I sort of fast forward a little bit. I continued to work on that, and as I got more clinically interested in cardiology, it became really clear that there were a lot of really interesting research ethics questions in cardiology, and specifically in the acute care space, which is where I started to be more clinically interested, and those things just sort of logically kind of paired together.
So it was taking what you learned or what you were working on early on and taking it with you to where your clinical interests lay.
Yeah, I remember, as I started to get interested in trying to combine those things, I remember having this thought of, well, there's really not anybody I know. Maybe there was one person at the time who might have identified as sort of a cardiologist and ethicist. And I remember having this thought that there's one of two situations here, right? One is the for lack of a better way of saying it, the market is there, right? There's a set of issues that are there to be addressed, and the issue is just that nobody's really dedicated themselves to focusing on that. The other was, maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree and there's real resistance. And certainly it's turned out to be the former, not the latter, that this is, I think, a wide open space in cardiology, and a lot of interest in engaging some really interesting sets of questions, and really a growing number of people that start to think about them, whether they define themselves as kind of ethicists or not.
And you got your foot in the door with that first publication, which was
it's been a downhill slide ever since.
New England Journal of Medicine. First
right.
Author paper is for your first publication.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, that's right. I my first paper ever was a sounding board in the New England Journal, and I have been on one other paper in the New England Journal in the many, many years since. That was published in 1999. So it's been a downward slide.
And I remember, I wouldn't say that. You're.
I don't think
you're too humble. But I remember when you came to Emory. I mean, I was involved in interviewing you when you came to Emory, and the question was, who would you work with, and who would be your mentor?
Yeah.
So how did you fill that in?
Yeah. So yeah, I remember that question too, and I'm meeting with you and others in the division, and I owe Emory a real thanks for being willing to, I guess, sort of take a risk on me, in the sense that we sort of agreed we'd figure it out. I think I was lucky, right? that 2-year fellowship I already mentioned at NIH was absolutely the sort of bedrock on which my career was built. It helped me it certainly opened my eyes to what I wanted to work on, but also gave me a network of people that I started to know and that I could collaborate with. I was at Hopkins also for my PhD training and had collaborators from there too that worked on similar sets of issues. And as I was thinking about where to come for fellowship, I had a pretty good network of people externally already that I could go to think about how I could structure projects. And really there was again, I think a lot of this is about luck, but and this was identified in the process of interviewing, so it wasn't like I just showed up and found out about this. But Becky Pence in the Winship Cancer Institute was starting to get involved with some projects that David Wright in the emergency department was doing. It was the first set of studies that Emory was doing using what's called the exception from informed consent for emergency research, where essentially you do trials in emergency contexts with often unconscious people who can't provide consent. You have to enroll them before you can engage family members. So that's what I had worked on in the context of my dissertation, and so basically I kind of teamed up a bit with Becky and David, and we were able to embed some projects into a large network that was going on. And really those collaborations still exist today, and that was really what gave me a kind of foothold and a group to work with. My first couple of grants as a fellow were really through those collaborations.
Well, that is fortunate that you found that, and I guess the training that you had in Bethesda or NIH. It's very important for establishing that
combination
basis of doing that kind of work in a place where you are not. There's not a lot of people doing that kind of work.
That's right. It was a combination of the training I got at NIH and also my PhD training at Hopkins, where I had sort of mentors and networks that I could. I often tell people I don't necessarily advise the same to go into a situation where there aren't sort of clear. There isn't the same kind of clear mentorship and clear program to plug yourself into is risky, and I don't necessarily, I wouldn't advocate that, but that it felt like the right thing, and I also felt like I felt like the pieces were all there, so we could make it work.
That's very interesting. You mentioned the exceptions for informed consent, and I've heard you speak about. There's two ways we consent people, I guess, right? One is consent people for clinical trials. Mm-hmm. One is this exceptions for informed consent, as you mentioned, related to participants who can't really consent, but are in emergency situations. And then there's a regular consent for
clinical treatment?
For clinical treatment or for participation. But your work is trying to find something in between. Is that accurate, or are you or identify what people should be doing in between that?
So maybe I can. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by in between, but
well, this concept of precision consent or tailored consent or that. Concept?
So I maybe I'll answer it a little bit more broadly and then get into more specifically. I think a more direct answer. So I think one of the things that I've tried to do is think about what the role of consent is in the specific situation, and I think it's there's this sort of stock answer that we help people be fully informed and we respect autonomous decisions, but there's a lot of other things that communication and decision making accomplishes. And so we've done some writing with some colleagues about sort of functions of consent. And one of the things that I try to do is I try to think about what the functions of that conversation can be in a context. So I do try to, a lot of what we've done has been about making making consent sort of context appropriate. And one of the spaces where that comes out, and maybe this is the in-between sort of piece you're referencing, are that, and we see this a lot in my sort of clinical world and when we do research on involving populations that I take care of, but people with heart attack, stroke, these kinds of acute conditions where, especially if you look at heart attack itself is not incapacitating, right? We talk to those people before they go to the cath lab. We engage them. We tell them what's happening. But, and this is really the case that motivated a lot of my work in the first place. Imagine coming into the hospital, you're having a heart attack, you're having chest pain, you're told what's happening. You got to go to the cath lab now. And by the way, would you like to be in a randomized trial comparing, procedure A versus procedure B or medicine A versus medicine B? And my response was, patients are probably pretty likely to hit you in the face. Like, what the hell are you asking me to do? I'm having a heart attack. Like, you can't talk to me about that. So we've done a lot of work to look at, in acute settings like this, what do people want out of that? Like, what kind of process is actually respectful and appropriately engaging of patients? And I have to say we've been surprised by a lot of what we found. Turns out people are not that mad about being asked. They actually like the transparency. They appreciate being asked. They also don't often really understand what they're getting into, but they say that's okay, right? So there's this really interesting tension about kind of thinking about what the function of that conversation needs to be and what do we do as clinicians and investigators that maximally respects the people who we're engaging with. So that's kind of what we've been working with. And in some cases that is, involved, if trials are being done using the exception from informed consent, then it's all about just how do we interact with people and families in the most respectful way possible, knowing we can't get consent. In other cases, it's about trying to done a lot of work to try to really pare down consent forms. Like we all know we see consent forms that are, 20 pages for an acute MI or acute stroke trial where someone's got 5 minutes to learn about a study and make a decision. And we've said, look, if we're really trying to respect people, we need to make that just a couple of pages long and focus on things that people actually want to hear about rather than, things that sort of check administrative boxes.
That is very interesting. You're talking about some of the work you did at PCare.
Yeah, which is not a urology trial, right?
But you ended up in the joke about P.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, after our last podcast guest, that might be
all about nocturia.
That might be appropriate. I mean, that's the theme between the two podcasts.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Ted can call something PCare anytime he wants.
But in that study, you did develop a condensed or a easier to follow consent for this kind of situation.
Yeah.
People having stroke or MI.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, this was the first larger grant that I got. It was funded by PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and this was a trial that really had sort of three phases. One was try to understand people's experiences of consent in the context of acute stroke and heart attack trials. The second was to partner with a patient advisory panel, which we met with over a period of 3 or 4 years on a regular basis to basically, they helped us to design the instruments for the first part, but also to process those data and think about, what do we do with this and how do we turn the process into something as meaningful as it can be given the constraints that we're operating in. And then the last part was to develop something that could be implemented within a trial and study it. So it was a really, the transformative thing about that project for me, there are two things about that project that were really satisfying. One is, when you apply to PCORI for funding, you have to have a robust engagement with patients and have patients as partners in your research. And this wasn't a hard sell in this case because it was all about patients' experiences. But I don't think I expected the interaction with my patient advisory panel to be as meaningful or as helpful as it turned out to be. It was a great group of people, and really I learned things about their perceptions of what we were working on that you can't replace that. So that was really meaningful for me. And they were co-authors on our papers, and that was meaningful. They really created a lot of what we came up with. The third part that I would say we continue to work on the second big lesson is really hard to implement novel things within clinical trials. There's a lot of moving parts, and we had logistical barriers that, despite great collaborators, sort of fell through on 2 trials. And finally, we were able to really get something up and running and embedded within a very large clinical trial. And that trial is actually still ongoing. So some of our outcomes are yet to be gathered, or they're in the process of being gathered. But we're starting to see more traction of that, and we've been able to kind of break through of some, what I would say, administrative barriers to doing this right in several cases. And when you talk to IRBs and say you want to cut down a consent form from 20 pages to 4, you get a lot of concern. But then when you say, look, this comes from, patients told us this is what they care about. This isn't about trying to short circuit things or shortcut things. This is about actually trying to make it meaningful. And the power of that kind of argument is pretty substantial.
Yeah, that's incredible. Incredibly interesting about what you need to go through to make these kind of changes. And it occurred to me that you have to get consent to change the consent. I guess is that
no, yeah. So we're no, you don't. So I think one of the things that it's. I have several colleagues around the country who also do work on things related to research recruitment, and we often joke that you can, if you present something to an IRB that involves giving them some sort of potentially toxic drug that might kill them, that's sort of part and parcel of what they do, and they're used to looking. But you say you want to change a consent form, all of a sudden people go haywire and think this is really risky.
Yeah.
But no, we often don't, right? So we for these kinds of interventions, we have different consent paradigms. I'll just give you 2 examples. We're in the process of planning, and we're trying to find a trial to partner with to really do this. But we have a center in collaboration with University of Pennsylvania that involves looking at different incentive structures for participating in a cardiovascular clinical trial. And we will be randomizing people to different amounts of money and look at the impact of that on various outcomes, including representativeness within the trial population. But we won't get consent ahead of time to randomize them to different incentive levels, because that would obviously contaminate what we're trying to do. Similarly, we're doing a trial right now looking at cost disclosure of heart failure medicines. And we do get consent because the visits have to be recorded, and we do follow-up surveys and that kind of stuff. But the consent form is intentionally vague about the purpose of the study with regard to specific cost disclosures, because the control group doesn't get that information. And we don't want to highlight the fact that we're trying to study what people do with information about money. So we have interesting approaches to consent sometimes for our own research.
I want to get back to the economic, sort of story behind consent. But first, I wanted to ask you: a patient having an MI or a stroke, do they want to participate in a clinical trial? I mean, what is the default approach or attitude of somebody who's very sick and are faced with participation in a clinical trial?
Yeah, so it's funny, or maybe I'll ask you, what is your guess that the consent rates are very high, or that the consent rates are very low?
I would think low.
Yeah, so it turns out they're really high, mostly because their reaction is, I'm having a heart attack, whatever you say. And so most people tend to sort of go along with it. I remember looking, if you look at, I still think it's pretty funny, but if you look at the IABP Shock 2 trial, which looked at balloon pumps in the context of patients who are having heart attacks with cardiogenic shock, so super sick population, I forget what exactly the number is, but something like 95% of people signed up, agreed to participate in the trial. And that's because, they're just super sick. Whatever you say goes. There's another sort of pre-hospital.
Whatever you say as the research
person taking care. So usually it's the same person taking care of them, right? So I mean, the interventional cardiologist in that case, it's hard to set up a system where the interventional cardiologist who's taking care of a patient in an emergency is not the person asking for consent. There have been some people who have said we should try to do that, but when you start to try to separate it, you've got multiple people then having encounters with someone who's very sick, and it's not clear that advances anything that the patient cares about. So in general, when you look at acute care trials, the rates of consent tend to be pretty high. Now, I'm thinking particularly time-limited kinds of things, right? So that's the norm.
That's not just cardiology.
No, and you see it in the context of other critical care trials too. Now, when people have longer time to, one of the things we're interested in, and we're actually putting in a grant proposal to look at this right now, is there's an acute PE trial that we're partnering with where people have a longer time to make a decision, and the trial is testing different kinds of standard therapy. So it's not about like access to something new or different. It's really about, does one form of standard treatment do better than another form of standard treatment? And we're really interested in what the enrollment rate's going to be because, the primary benefit for a study like that, the risks are somewhat low because the risks are the same as standard care, but the primary benefit is really that we'll have a better sense of what the right treatment is moving forward, but people have access to either of the treatments already. So we're a little worried about in a study like that, is that going to resonate with people, right? It's not like they're getting access to some new super duper treatment. It's just like we as a medical community will actually know what the hell we're doing with regard to.
So that's a very new area of research.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this issue of how we do comparative effectiveness trials, which we certainly need in lots of domains. There's a lot of standard practices that haven't been effectively compared. And the right approach to engaging people in that and the right kind of design to use and the right approach to consent has not been well worked out, but it's pretty contentious.
And it depends also, your research obviously depends on what population of patients you're dealing with, right? I mean, have you looked at this?
Yeah, so this center that I mentioned earlier, it's called the Better Center, but it's a project that Alana Morris and Modele Ogani and I from Emory, in partnership with colleagues at Washington Hospital Center in Penn. It's part of an AHA, American Heart Association funded, strategically focused research network to address issues of representativeness in clinical trials, because we know that in a lot of cardiovascular trials, a lot of trials, period, there's been under enrollment of a lot of minoritized and disadvantaged groups. And there's a lot of concerns about, because of really significant past abuses, obviously real concerns about levels of trust and enrollment and sort of patterns of consent in different populations. The literature, I would say, is pretty incomplete in that space. What we know is that there is often under-enrollment of minoritized populations. What I think is less clear is what's the driver. Quickly, people tend to go towards explanations related to trust or other kinds of issues about really that would affect consent rates. But what we know from the oncology literature, for example, would suggest that the rates of consent are often quite similar in clinical trials. What's different is who's approached. So one of the things I think is really important to figure out when we look at sort of disparities in trial enrollment is it because people aren't being diagnosed with the condition, people are getting care in different places where the trials aren't being conducted, or is it something about, people actually saying no when they're asked? And I think we're sometimes quick to assume it's the latter when in reality there are a lot of other drivers that may be the issue. We're actually interested in whether, it's an issue of, ironically, under support or underpayment, right? So classically, the worry about paying people for participating in research is you only get poorer populations participating in the studies. We're interested in whether that underpayment is actually a problem, so that people for whom participating is a bigger opportunity cost may actually be saying no because they can't afford to do it. So we're sort of flipping that on its head and testing whether creative use of incentive structures could actually help to improve diversity in our trial populations. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about this issue.
Two things come to mind. One is it also depends on who's doing the asking.
Yeah, not great data on that, but certainly a lot of conventional wisdom.
So I imagine if you're being asked by someone who doesn't look like you, that might be a problem.
We certainly have. There's more data on like race concordance, for example, in the clinical space than there is in the research context. But certainly that's I think a real belief that people have that the more you can relate to the person who's asking you, the more likely you are to at least have an attitude of trust towards them. I think that's true. The real impact of that in the context of different kinds of clinical trials hasn't been well studied. What I think is really interesting is, and I think, again, this sort of flips a lot of the concerns on its head, one of the things you have to be really careful about is you have to make sure that trust is well placed, right? So what you don't want to do is you don't want to capitalize on that and somehow not address things that people really care about. We certainly have examples of where that's been, trust has been abused. So you have to make sure the trust, if you're going to try to promote it, is well placed.
Unethically abused.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking about was this American Heart Association project you're talking about. It's not necessarily acute care or emergency care.
That's right. Yep.
So it involves the spectrum, I guess.
Yeah. So we're interested.
Seems enormously complicated.
It is complicated. It's complicated on lots of ways, and one of the things is I think it's clear that that project has a lot of moving parts, a lot of different components to it. So it addresses different kinds of interventions in different kinds of research contexts. But one of the things I think is really important is that research enrollment and consent is not monolithic, right? There's some data, for example, with regard to disparities that trial rates of consent in trials is not that different, but rates of consent for observational or genetic studies does seem to be different. And signing up for one is different from the other. I mean, when you're signing up for a clinical trial, that's kind of grounded in some sort of clinical decision.
Yeah.
But if you're just giving blood or somebody's, asking you questions, it's a very different proposition for the person. And I think there's better evidence that some of the trust issues are
someone's going to take your genes.
Yeah, there's more of that.
Take your blood.
Yeah.
There's a couple questions that we'd like to ask our guests about. Questions we want to hear them all, and I guess you listening to the podcast, you probably know some of these questions.
Some of them. Yeah.
One of the questions is like, what did you do? What did you do early in your research career that you regret and you advise people not to do?
Yeah, I listened to other people's answers to that too, so I was a little prepared for it. I think all of us have lots of things that mistakes we might have made, many of which we learned from. I think I probably, as a PhD student especially, was a little too focused on. I was a little narrow-minded. I was doing a PhD program that was kind of an interdisciplinary program in health policy and bioethics. And I had a really specific idea of what I wanted to work on for my dissertation. I knew I really wanted to engage in some of the important philosophical concepts. And I think especially now that I work on things like cost and whatnot, I kind of ignored a lot of the core curriculum that was about health economics and some other things that I just thought, I don't need this for what I want to work on. And I think my approach to a number of different things would have been more deeply informed by really just engaging in opportunities to learn. And so I think the lesson for me was don't be closed-minded about what's of interest and relevance. I mean, obviously you have to focus a little bit, but I think I was a little arrogantly self-assured about what I needed to know. And I could have. You
should have gone to class that day with the health economics.
More of that
lesson.
And I shouldn't have, especially if I was going to do it. I mean, I did well, but I sort of would do fine to get a good grade on the test, but it was all about that rather than really having a grown-up approach and really engaging in the material in ways that could have been beneficial for my career.
That's great advice. What about the flip side of that, which is what is one thing you did that you would recommend others to do as they're developing their research programs?
Probably the most important thing for me, especially when I came here, was establishing good collaborations. I in ethics, especially as a research ethicist, I needed partners doing clinical trials. And at the time, I collaborate a lot more in recent years with my colleagues in cardiology. I have a number of people that we're writing grants with now, and to me, that's one of the real sources of pleasure in what I do. But early on, it was finding good partners, mostly outside of cardiology, where I served a need and we could collectively explore a set of questions. And being open-minded about where those collaborations might be, and what was really the key for my success. I mean, everything I did for the first, including fellowship, the grants I had in fellowship and as a junior faculty member were definitely a function of those external collaborations, both outside of our division, but also outside of the institution.
So the importance of team science, identifying where you would fit into a team, and it sounds like in cardiology, for example, there's very fertile ground for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You need consent for just about everything you do in cardiology, right?
The other thing I think that I think is of relevance was not having. There's sometimes people are too willing to have preconceived notions about what's fundable and what's not, and I think sometimes if you're talking with people and you get enough resonance that the question you're asking is real, and you feel like you know how to answer it, reviewers will think the same thing.
Yeah.
That you have to find the right places, but don't be too dissuaded by conventional wisdom about what is and isn't doable.
Well, Sarah, our talk today with Neal Dickert has been fascinating, but we've gone way over our 30-minute research ride time. So we're thinking, Sarah, about turning this into a two-parter.
I think that's a great idea, Charlie.
So we have just finished part 1 of this podcast, and please tune in for part 2, which we will resume our conversation with Dr. Dickert as he discusses more of the aspects of his research. Thanks for joining me on another great research ride. Our guest today was Dr. Neal Dickert. Producers of this podcast are Sarah McClellan and Ben Searles. Ben is also the editor of this podcast. Theme music composer is Hannah Searles. This has been your ride leader, Charlie Searles, and I will see you next time.